Week 3 of spooky season is here. Let's tell some ghost stories. Welcome to Hearth of Hymonia. My name is Kate, and we are continuing with our spooky season content. Last week, I talked about the veneration of ancestors in ancient Rome. If you missed that video, I will pop it in the description down below. We are continuing our discussion of spirit encounters today. Spirit encounters are some of the most common and recognizable spooky stories there are, and this has always been true. Any society that believes in the possibility of some kind of existence after death must necessarily believe that it is possible for interaction between that existence and this one to occur. This is how spirit encounter tales develop. And given that most societies around the world believe in some kind of afterlife, this is why these kinds of stories are so common. Last week, I talked about ancestor veneration when a relationship between the living and the dead is intentionally cultivated and interaction is sought after for the purposes of guidance and general comfort from your deceased loved ones. And this week I'm going to talk about what happens when you don't intentionally cultivate that relationship, or rare instances when an extraordinary encounter between a spirit and a living person occur. So what happens when you actually encounter a spirit? To have an encounter between a living person and the spirit of a person who has passed on, a few things need to be true. First and foremost, there needs to be some kind of existence after death. This is pretty fundamental. So in societies where these stories come up, you can expect some kind of generalized belief that there is an afterlife. And next, whatever part of the self survives after death has to be somewhere. The Greeks and Romans believed in an underworld, an actual place that housed the spirits of dead people. And even though spirits are described as being formless or massless, nonetheless they exist in this place. And I mentioned, I think last week, that this place was thought of as existing in part at least on the same plane as the world of the living, and it could be accessed by living people at certain geographical points. We'll talk a little bit about that and how that can be done and some of the stories about that later in this video. If there can be interaction between the world of the living, the physical geographical world of the living, and the world of the dead, and living people can access the underworld, that means necessarily that the reverse is true, that spirits can from time to time go from the world of the dead to the world of the living, and they do so in stories about hauntings and other stuff like that. And the next thing that needs to happen for a spirit encounter is that the spirit of a dead person can, in one way or another, communicate with the world of the living. It's not enough to be in the world of the living, they have to make themselves known somehow. You've heard ghost stories about flickering lights, slamming doors, the sounds of people talking but no one's there, music being played, all of those kinds of things. Necessarily, spirits need to be able to make their presence known in one way or another in order to have the interaction in the first place. So how does all of this happen? You've heard me talk about the thinning of the veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and how this barrier, which is portrayed as a veil, grows thin at certain times of year, allowing for people to more easily pass through one way or another or communicate between the two planes of existence, if you want. Now, this specific imagery comes from traditional Celtic spirituality, and in traditional Celtic paganism, there are 2 points in the year, and this develops in other spiritual traditions like Wicca as well, where the veil grows thinnest at this time of year leading up to Samhain, which is on the same day as Halloween, and at the opposite end of the year in the beginning of May during a season called Beltane or Bealtaine. And the thought that certain times of year were more apt for spirit communication is not exclusive to Celtic paganism. If you've seen the Disney movie Coco, for example, they really do a great job of portraying Dia de los Muertos when the barrier, I think it's been a minute since I've seen the movie, but I think they portray it as like a bridge, not a physical bridge, but like a spiritual bridge, and the dead can actually walk across this bridge at this time of year, and then they have to come back at the end of the night, basically. This is a really good portrayal of the conception that certain times of year are better for communication. In the context of Greco-Roman antiquity, the time of year when the veil grew thinnest was February. Of course, they didn't have the veil imagery. It was just a time of year when spirit communication was more easily facilitated. And so all of the ancestor veneration festivals took place in February. And they also had another festival to protect from evil spirits, and that was at the beginning of May. I wonder if that led to the belief about Bealtaine, but we can talk about that another time. They also had geographical places where communication could more easily take place. So, as I said before, the underworld could be accessed by living people, and the way that they did this was to actually go to the place, and there were several, where an entrance to this underworld was said to exist. One that we'll see later in the video, for example, is at Cumae in Italy, but there were others as well. So not only is communication possible at certain times of year, but it's also possible in certain geographical locations. This is something that we don't have today. There's no cave in Iowa that is supposed to be the entrance to hell, for example. There are certain things that are called, this hell and that hell, and, but it's not legitimately conceived of as a place where you can actually go down and, meet the devil. That is something that we don't have, but it shows up a lot in these stories, so I just wanted to make that clear as we get started here. So let's start with some examples of spirits visiting the world of the living, either of their own volition or having been summoned by living people. In last week's video, I mentioned the festival of Parentalia, a 9-day feast that took place in February, which was all about honoring your ancestors, giving them offerings, giving them due piety, and all the rest. And I talked about how Ovid mentions what happened one time when these rites were ignored. I said I was going to come back to it this week, so here we are. Ovid says, "But one time, while waging long wars with fighting arms, they abandoned the days of Parentalia. It was not unpunished, for they say that from that omen Rome grew hot with suburban pyres. I hardly believe it, but it is said that ancestors came out from their tombs, wailing in the quiet night, and souls with strange forms howled through the streets of the city, and through the wide fields, a massless crowd. After this, the honors that had been passed by were restored, and there came an end to the omens and the funerals." In this story, the ancestors are angered because they don't get their proper offerings and they don't get their proper reverence and veneration as is their due per Roman pious ritual law, we'll say. These are the rites that were established by Aeneas, who is the ancestor of all Romans, and so he decided how religion had to be, and when that was ignored, the ancestors got angry. It's a powerful warning to do your duty towards your ancestors, because otherwise they will come after you, and your neglect will literally come back to haunt you. The haunting at Parentalia was a course corrector for the living, and a lot of times spirit encounters are like this. Another haunting of a similar sort comes from Book 2 of the Aeneid, speaking of Aeneas himself. Aeneas is fleeing the ruins of Troy when he's approached by the spirit of his wife Creusa, and this is actually how he finds out that she died, because she just died in the sack of Troy by the Greeks. He finds out that she's gone because her spirit appears to him. So I'm going to read the passage from Stanley Lombardo's translation, and I will link this in the description down below. By the way, if you're interested in reading the Aeneid in English at all, this is the way to go. This is a masterful translation. It's really accessible to modern English speakers. It's just phenomenal. It's moving, it's passionate, it preserves the Latin, and yet it is not, thee, thou having been. So it's a really, really good translation. Highly recommend it. And I'm going to read the passage from this one to you now. So Vergil says, "But as I rushed through the empty shells of buildings, frantic to find her, there rose before my eyes the sad ghost of Creusa herself, an image larger than life. I was transfixed, my hair stood on end, and my voice choked. Then she spoke to me and calmed my fears. 'What good does it do, my sweet husband, to indulge in such mad grief? These things do not happen without the will of the gods. You may not take your Creusa with you. The Lord of Olympus does not allow it. Long exile is yours, plowing a vast stretch of sea. Then you will come to Hesperia, where the Lydian Tiber runs gently through fertile fields. There happy times, kingship, and a royal wife shall be yours. Dry your tears for your beloved Creusa. I shall not look upon the proud domains of the Myrmidons or Dolopians, nor go to be a slave for Greek matrons. I, a Trojan woman and wife of the son of the goddess Venus. No, the great mother keeps me on these shores. Farewell, and keep well your love for our child.' Creusa spoke, and then left me there weeping, with many things yet to say. She vanished into thin air. 3 times I tried to put my arms around her. 3 times her wraith slipped from my hands, soft as a breeze, like a vanishing dream." The main purpose of Creusa's visit to Aeneas is to inform him that she has died, and unfortunately she has died for plot purposes. If you've read the rest of the Aeneid, you'll know that Aeneas has to be single in order to encounter more than one woman along his way. But the secondary purpose, arguably the more important one, is that Creusa is supposed to tell Aeneas what his destiny is. She informs him that the gods have willed it, that his fate is to go and found a new colony in Italy, which he eventually reaches, and that even though he'll face hardships along the way, nevertheless he has to pursue on and found this new race of people that will eventually become Rome. This is an encounter where Creusa actually appears to him in front of him. He's not dreaming, he's awake, and she shows up in this world, in the plane of the living. He can see her, but she's maskless. He can't touch her. He tries to embrace her. He can't do it. But nevertheless, there she is in front of him. This encounter brings up something that we will see over and over and over again in the rest of the stories that I'm going to tell today, and that is that spirits have knowledge that the living do not have access to. Aeneas does not inherently know what he's meant to do, where he's meant to go, and what he's meant to achieve. It seems that instantly after her death, because she's a ghost, I mean, he was just with her 5 minutes before. It's chaos, right? Everybody's fleeing the city. He's trying to keep everybody together. He's got a young kid. He has a father who doesn't walk too well. He's trying to keep them all together. And he looks, his wife is gone. And then the next thing he knows, there she is in front of him as a ghost. Almost instantly after her death, not only does she have more knowledge than she did when she was alive, she has critical knowledge for the rest of the story. She knows what Aeneas is fated to do. That is big, big knowledge that she has that she's able to deliver to him. Those are some stories of a spirit paying a visit to the world of the living to speak to particular individuals. This time, we're talking about when spirits inhabit a particular place. In the Mostellaria, which is a comedy written by the Roman playwright Plautus, we get this story about a ghost that is haunting a house. It's a funny story, it's absurd, it's actually entirely made up, as you'll see in a second, but it does give us some information about what people thought regarding haunted houses, at least in the Roman period. The story goes like this. There's a kid named Philolaches, whose father is a wealthy merchant. His father's named Theopodes. And Theopodes is away on business for an extended period of time. So Philolaches does what any good pious Roman son would do, and he throws wild parties every night and basically a constant stream of food, wine, everything you could imagine is happening at these parties. They're trashing the house, they're eating through Theopodes' savings, and so on. Philolaches is aided in this mischievous activity by the chief slave of the house, a guy named Tranio, who is constantly running errands, going out to the port and the markets, getting more food and more wine to bring back to Philolaches and all of his bummy friends. On one of these trips, Tranio happens to see at the port Theopodes back from business much earlier than expected, and knowing the deep pile of doo-doo that they have dug for themselves, he runs back to the house and tells Philolaches, we gotta get everybody out, we have to clean up really fast, your dad is on his way from the port right now. And so they get to cleaning up, and of course it's, a bunch of drunk people, it's like herding cats, right? It's all very comical. And they realize that they're not going to be able to get this accomplished before Theopodes arrives at the house, so they have to delay him outside the house somehow. This is where the ghost story comes in. While Philolaches and friends are cleaning up inside, Tranio is stationed outside the house to wait for Theopodes to come back. When he does come back, Tranio tells him that he can't go in the house, he can't even touch the door, he's gonna curse them all, because the house is in fact haunted. And Tranio spends a lot of time setting this up. He's like, oh, don't touch the door. Oh my god, tell me you didn't touch the door. Oh no, everything is terrible and bad, and we've been besought by this major problem, and everything is terrible. And Theopodes is sitting there going, would you just tell me what's going on? And Tranio is like, oh, it's so bad, right? So he strings him along, he's delaying, and eventually he tells the story that there was a traveler back in the day who came to town and needed a place to stay, so he stayed at this house with the former owner prior to Theopodes and Philolaches and all of them moving into it. So the characters in the story are not actually related to the haunting at all. A past owner let this traveler stay at his house, but he ended up murdering the guy while he was there. The guy was never given a proper burial, and thus he could never rest in peace, and so now he haunts this house. Tranio says, for those reasons, we can just never go back in here at all. And, shenanigans ensue, the whole thing goes on and on and on. Eventually, Theopodes figures it out, but because it's a comedy, and comedies typically have happy endings, nobody really gets in trouble for their crazy partying, and everybody just sort of laughs it off. And that's the story. Now, even though this story is made up by the character who is telling it, nevertheless, it tells us a little bit about what people thought about haunted houses. So it was possible for a spirit to inhabit the place of their untimely death, particularly if they had not been given proper burial rites. People who die prematurely, either as children or, in some other way that is not common, like being murdered, for example, these are not spirits that can very easily rest in peace. When you couple that with the lack of funerary rites. I talked about this last week, how it's important to go through the proper ritual in order to ensure that the spirit of the dead person can pass down into the underworld and, rest in peace, happily ever after. When those rites are not taken care of, then the spirit can't really go anywhere. It's stuck in the world of the living, and so you get this kind of haunted house. This, I think, is probably the most common form of ghost story in, for example, modern Hollywood. haunted houses where like a family moves into a home that is like old and a little bit spooky, but it's a great price, so they move in, and then they start to notice that something is weird with the house, and there's a haunting, and, you know, sometimes the ghosts are friendly, sometimes the ghosts are unfriendly, there's danger involved. This is pretty common nowadays, I think, so this is the exact same kind of thing that's happening in this story. There's a house that is haunted by an unhappy spirit, and it's dangerous to be around this spirit because you don't know what the spirit's gonna do. The next story that I'm gonna tell is one where it's not supposed to be made up. It's an account that's told in earnest. So this next one comes from the letters of Pliny the Younger. This is the guy who is most famous for being an eyewitness to the eruption of Vesuvius, which he details in some letters to the historian Tacitus. He also writes these other letters, tons and tons of them, and one of them he tells this story. So the story goes like this. I'm going to summarize it very quickly. There was a house in Athens that nobody was willing to stay in. It was a beautiful house, but nobody wanted to stay in it because there had been reports of hauntings. A spirit of an older man rattling chains and wailing and doing all the typical spooky ghost stuff. So nobody wanted to rent this house. So a philosopher, because philosophers love to write about philosophers and their heroic exploits, a philosopher was traveling and needed a place to stay while he was in Athens. And he had heard that there was some weird stuff going on at the house, but he's a philosopher, so he can probably handle it, and he can't beat the price. You know, he's traveling on a shoestring budget, so he rents the place out. In his first night, he stays up really late writing, and the spirit appears to him just as described, an old man with chains on his wrists and ankles. The philosopher, being engaged in important philosophical work, tells the spirit to wait a minute because what he's doing is really important. The ghost continues to pester him and he continues to tell the ghost to wait. This goes on for some time, and eventually when he finishes up his important philosophical work, he turns to the ghost and says, "All right, what do you want?" And the ghost continues to just sort of point in another direction, and the philosopher gathers that he's supposed to follow the ghost. So he follows the ghost to this other spot where the ghost just kind of stands there for a minute and then disappears. Because this guy is a philosopher, he immediately knows what this means. So the next morning he goes to the local authorities and says there is a body buried under the foundation, not properly buried, and that is the ghost that is haunting this house. They send somebody over, they do a little digging up, and they find the body. They carry out the proper funeral rites. The ghost is able to rest in peace, and everybody lives happily ever after thanks to the heroic exploits of the philosopher. This is a very straightforward story, and it's pretty much exactly identical to the last one we talked about. A spirit is haunting a house because there was a lack of proper burial. We don't really get the details of the person's death in this case, but we don't really need them. Either way, once proper burial rites have been observed, the ghost can rest in peace and is no longer haunting the house. I like this story because, in a way, you know, the ghost was trying to communicate the whole time. It just so happens that the way that the ghost appears is very scary, and so no one was able to actually help the ghost out because all the ghost was doing was asking for help. No one was able to do it because they were too afraid. But, you know, once someone actually put aside fear and was able to openly communicate with the spirit and figure out what it wanted, you know, everybody kind of was happy at the end because the ghost was able to get what he wanted. He was able to rest in peace and not have this horrible afterlife that he was currently living. And then, you know, the living were no longer scared to be in the house. So I think that's a really nice story, and it's pretty straightforward. I think we can all kind of very easily understand what's happening there. I want to take us slightly out of our way to talk about a story which is not unique, but I'll just mention one, where a spirit contacts the living through a dream. So the spirit doesn't actually go to the world of the living, but rather contacts the living through this other dream world. And we can get into what a dream world is at another time. But it's a sort of unusual state between the living and the dead where communication can happen. This story also comes from Book 2 of the Aeneid, and again I'll be reading Lombardo's translation. In this story, the ghost of Hector, who is a prince of Troy, who is the big old hero of the Trojan War for the Trojan side until he gets killed by Achilles. This guy is the guy who appears to Aeneas in a dream. I should also point out that this encounter happens before Aeneas encounters his dead wife. Alright, so this is what the passage says. At that late hour, when sleep begins to drift upon fretful humanity as grace from the gods, Hector appeared to me in my dreams. Pitiful spirit, weeping, black with blood and dust from the ruts of Achilles' chariot, thongs piercing his swollen ankles. Ah, how he looked! How different from that Hector who returned to Troy wearing Achilles' armor, the Hector who threw fire on the Danaan ships. His beard was matted, his hair clotted with gore, and he bore all the wounds he had received fighting before his country's walls. In my dream I blurted out to him these tearful words. Light of Dardania, Troy's finest hope, what has delayed you? From what shores have you come to answer our prayers? We have suffered many losses since you left us, Hector. Yet we have labored on, and now we see you at the end of our strength. Why has your face been defiled, and what are these wounds I see? My empty questions meant nothing to him. With a heavy sigh from deep within, he said, Run, child of the goddess, save yourself from these flames. The enemy holds the walls. Great Troy is falling. Enough has been given to Priam and his country. If Pergamum's height could be defended by a hero's hand, its defense would have been this hand of mine. Troy commends to you the gods of the city. Accept them as companions of your destiny, and seek for them the great walls you will found after you have wandered across the sea. He spoke and brought out from the sanctuary great Vesta, her chaplets, and her eternal fire. Hector appears to Aeneas in a dream and informs him that Troy is a lost cause. Up until this point, they've been fighting. Aeneas has been, witness to a decade of war in his hometown. And Hector finally says, look, there's no hope. The Greeks have won, and there's nothing we can do about it. The best thing that you can do for Troy at this moment is to get yourself out and to take with you Troy's sacred relics. So the worship of Vesta, the worship of domestic gods, the Lares and the Penates. And this is the subject of Bernini's famous Aeneas statue, the statue of him fleeing Troy, and he has, his father is holding these sacred objects. Hector says it's really important for you to take these and flee from Troy. You gotta get out of here because there's no hope left. And if you stay here, you're just gonna die with everybody else. Do the best you can, get as many people out as you can, and start over somewhere new. Hector is delivering crucial information to Aeneas, just like Creusa does, just like all of the other encounters that we've seen where information is delivered like this. And it really sets the plot in motion going forward because the rest of Book 2 is Aeneas preparing to leave Troy. He has to go and get the sacred objects, he has to get all of his family members and try and get as many people out as he can. It's all because Hector has appeared to him in this dream. In terms of Rome's literary origins, in terms of Rome's mythological origins, this is it. It all starts with these encounters that Aeneas has with these ghosts. So, spirit encounters can be wildly important in terms of the mythological landscape of antiquity. I have 2 more stories to share, and they're pretty much identical. We've been talking about encounters where the dead visit the world of the living or visit the living in some way, make contact, initiate contact with them, or otherwise exist in their world, in the world of the living. There are a number of stories, and I've chosen 2 just as examples, but there's a ton of stories of living people initiating contact with the dead and paying the dead a visit at their home, the underworld. This type of story is called a katabasis. I talked about sort of the features of this story and the philosophy behind this story in my Persephone video, which I'll leave a link to in the description as well. But suffice it to say that a katabasis entails a person, most often a hero, traveling to the underworld through some way or another, engaging in some kind of activity that allows them to pass into the underworld and to communicate with the dead, and then returning to the world of the living. That half of the story is called an anabasis. Katabasis means going down, anabasis means coming back up. The two that I've chosen are one from the Odyssey and one, yet again, from the Aeneid, since I figure we're talking about it anyway. So in the Odyssey, Odysseus is hanging out with Circe, and he's been hanging out with Circe for an extended period of time, and he gets bored of the lavish, wonderful lifestyle of sex, drugs, and rock and roll that he has been treated to at Circe's house, and he decides he wants to move on with his journey. And Circe says, okay, but just so you know, you have to go to the underworld next. Odysseus really doesn't want to go down to the underworld, but Circe assures him that it doesn't mean that he's gonna die. He just has to go and find out some information from the prophet Tiresias. Tiresias is a famous seer from Antiquity. He shows up in a ton of different works in different ways. But in the Odyssey, he has died. And so in order to talk to him, Odysseus has to go to the underworld. So again, the underworld is a physical place that can be reached by traveling to certain places. So Odysseus goes to one of these entrances of the underworld and he makes offerings to the dead. Milk, honey, wine, barley, water, and at long last a black ram whose blood is the sort of key to communicating. So any spirit that drinks the blood of the ram can talk to Odysseus. And Circe warns him, make sure Tiresias gets some of the blood first because you really need to talk to him, and then after you talk to him, you can talk to whoever else you want. So Odysseus does this, and Tiresias tells him, you're going to be on a long journey. You've been having such trouble getting home because you pissed off Poseidon, and unfortunately there's not too much you can do about that. You're just going to have to suffer your way through. And eventually you will make it home, so you better get going. And after Odysseus learns, again, this crucial knowledge from Tiresias, then he talks to a bunch of other people, including his mother, and Achilles, and a member of his crew that had died that Odysseus didn't even know that he died, and all these other people that he sees and encounters while he's down there. And then because it's a katabasis story, he returns back to the world of the living and gets the heck out of there and continues on his journey now that he has learned why he's been having so much trouble and the fact that he is actually going to make it home. And Tiresias also tells him about what's been happening at home, which is that there are suitors courting his wife, and so when he gets home he can expect another battle because he has to reassert himself as the king of Ithaca. It's no secret that this story inspired Vergil as he was writing the Aeneid in more ways than just this, but Aeneas also has to go through a katabasis for the same purpose. He is told that in order to continue his journey, he needs to learn some critical information. But instead of learning it from the prophet Tiresias, although I suppose he could have, because Tiresias presumably is still down there, Aeneas really needs to talk to his father. When Aeneas leaves Troy, his father comes with him, but he's very old and he dies along the way. So Aeneas has to go and find out some, again, critical information from his father. Aeneas goes to one of these underworld entrances that I mentioned. He actually goes to the one at Cumae in Italy, right? Because he's almost done with his journey. And there he meets the Sibyl of Cumae. She is a seer, a prophetess, and she's not dead, but she hangs out at the entrance of the underworld, and she helps Aeneas by telling him how to go about this katabasis. And it's very easy to get to the underworld, she says. It's not hard at all. Everybody eventually does it, but it's really hard to come back out alive. So she tells him he's got to get this golden bough. It's a whole thing. This encounter takes place during the entirety of Book 6, so I cannot possibly provide all the details. But Aeneas basically goes down to the underworld accompanied by the Sibyl. She helps him out, and he meets his father while he's down there, along with a bunch of other people. And his father delivers a prophecy to him and tells him, you know, you are fated to go to this part of Italy, to Latium, where you're going to have a battle, but you're going to join your line with the king of Latium, and you're going to found a city, and your descendants will found this great civilization called Rome. And then his father lays out the whole of Roman history from that period, which is so far back in history that it's mythological, all the way up to the time of Augustus. Vergil is writing under Augustus. We can talk about the politics of why Augustus is included in this at another time, but suffice it to say that it's the whole extent of Roman history. And the reason that his father does this is because he wants Aeneas to understand the importance of his journey and why he really does have to carry it out. Aeneas gets this prophecy, and just like Odysseus, he returns back to the world of the living with the Sibyl's help, because she has been helping him out this whole time, and then he goes on to the rest of his journey. These last two stories, as you can see, are pretty much identical. Some of the details are slightly different, but on the whole, they are the exact same story, which is the hero of the book needs critical information about his destiny, and he can only get it from the dead. And so the way to do that is to go to the underworld itself and encounter, particular spirits that can help him find more information. You can see, based on the fact that I talked about 3 spirit encounters in one work alone, this work right here, Vergil's Aeneid. And by the way, I didn't even mention all of them because he also runs into the ghost of his mother at one point, and so on and so forth. There's so many spirit encounters in this one book alone. So it speaks to how common these stories were in antiquity, and they show up in all different forms. They show up in comedy, they show up in letter writing, in sincere, honest philosophical discourse. They show up in epic, they show up all over the place. And this is not surprising given the beliefs that ancient Greeks and ancient Romans had about what happens to you after you die. There is existence after death. This is what it looks like. There's an underworld. You have a spirit, and you exist, but you don't have mass in the world of the living. You can encounter the world of the living as a dead person through either thinning of whatever the barrier is meant to be at certain times of year or in certain places. You might just be stuck in the world of the living depending on how your funeral went. And you can be summoned by humans in various ways, either through really gnarly witchcraft or through people visiting you in the world of the dead. So these stories are everywhere in antiquity. I think they're so much fun. They tell us a lot about belief in antiquity, and I just wanted to share them with you. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you like this kind of content and you want to see more, you can go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I post stuff like this all the time. Next week, I will be back with somehow the conclusion of our spooky season content. Not 100% sure what I'm going to be talking about, but it's probably going to be witches, so stay tuned. Thanks so much again for watching. I really appreciate you, and I will see you in the next video.